Ladies and gentlemen, I'm here with Dean Song Richardson from UC Irvine. Really honored to get a chance to talk to you. Thank you again for joining. We're going to be talking about a wide range of issues, but Dean Richardson is an expert on implicit bias, among other important topics that we are facing today and have been facing. So thank you.
Thank you for having me. I'm excited to engage in this conversation with you.
I'm just lucky to work with Kelly Barba, who introduced us and made this happen, and she's fantastic, and I know is joining us right now. So I just want to start, I've read so much, and there are so many topics to go over, but the story that I wanted to kick off with is a little bit about your background. You're biracial, the experience with your parents, and maybe an incident with a coffee can that you'd be willing to share.
So I have to say about the coffee can, which I'll share in a moment, some of my students who read about me growing up and the coffee can story reached out to me and said, Dean Richardson, you really want to share that story with the world? And I said, of course I do. It's part of who I am. It's part of what happened in my life. But I think and anyone listening in today will understand why my students said that. So you're right, I am biracial. My mom is a Korean immigrant, and my dad is a Black from the South, former officer in the military dad. And I was so lucky because my two younger brothers and I lived in Army bases because my dad, as I mentioned, was an officer in the Army. And so as I was growing up, it's only in retrospect that I realized how much my parents tried to shield my brothers and I from the reality of racism in our country. And it was really remarkable, I think, and so lucky that I was able to grow up on Army bases because the kids that I grew up with were mixed like me. So my best friend was Black and Korean, and it never occurred to me growing up to even think that much about the fact that being mixed race was something to be remarked upon. Just never occurred to me, except for a few times when people would say things to me like, oh, your skin is so beautifully tanned. And I would get so confused about what they were talking about. And then I would realize what they meant was they thought I was white and that I had a tan from being out in the sun. So it was when I got to college when people started asking me questions like, where are you from? Where are your parents from? And they would keep asking and asking until they got to the answer which they needed, which was to figure out what my racial background was and why I looked the way that I looked. And I call that being raced in college. And since that time, my life has really been a journey thinking about these issues of race in our country, wondering why and learning why people needed to categorize me. And I understand that so much better, especially when I think about implicit bias. So to answer your specific question, though, it was during this process of thinking and learning about race that I started reflecting back on the experiences I had growing up. And I see so many things differently. So the can story. So as I mentioned, my dad was in the military. And I remember that my brothers and I were in our big station wagon driving cross country because my dad had been sent to a different military base. And we would always have a picnic in the car and a coffee can. And we would stop at the side of the road. And the reason we had the coffee can is because we wouldn't go to restaurants. We wouldn't go to rest stops. We would stop at the side of the road, have our picnic, and use the coffee can as our toilet. That's what we did. And I thought everyone did that, right? I think most kids realize this. You think everyone has your experience and you only find out later that they don't. And so I thought back to that and I understood that in a way that I couldn't have then because I didn't have the perspective I had then. But I know why they did that, right? Because as you're driving cross country as a mixed race couple with a Black individual, an Asian individual, you just don't know what you might confront when you stop at a rest stop or at a restaurant. And what I realized today too, so my husband, I'm in a biracial relationship. My husband is white. He comes from a farm community in the middle of nowhere, Ohio. And when we used to drive to visit his family there, I felt exactly the same way that my parents did. My husband would want to stop by to eat at a random restaurant out in the middle of nowhere, and I wouldn't do it because I didn't feel safe, I guess is the word that I would use, or I felt anxious, right? Because I didn't know what would happen if I walked in to a random place in the middle of nowhere and walked in with my white husband. So I understood these things in retrospect. And I realize more and more, it feels like the more I study this, the more I think about these issues, the more I understand my parents' experience.
Yeah, it's the bubbles these wonderful parents create for us that actually lead to the bias in some ways, right? Whether it's your bias, somebody else's bias, we're going to get into all that. I know that you were quite an accomplished pianist when you were growing up and still are today, although I know you probably don't have quite as much time for it as you used to. Talk a little bit about that discipline and how you think it impacted your ability to be such a successful lawyer and thought leader.
Oh, thank you so much. So it's very stereotypical what I'm about to say. I don't know if you or anyone else on this call has read that book by Amy Chua called The Tiger Mom. And it was very controversial, that book, when it came out. But for me, it was cathartic. Because when I read that book, I suddenly understood that the life that I led with my Korean immigrant mother was not unusual. Because people often ask me, you have such discipline, Song, right? I used to practice 8 to 10 hours on the weekends and 4 to 6 hours during the week when I was growing up, all the way until I went to college. And the only reason I practiced that way is because my mom would sit next to me, right? Like I felt forced to become a concert pianist. It was her dream, not my dream. I would much rather have gone out and spent time with friends, right? But I couldn't. And so that discipline was instilled in me by my mother. I mean, she was amazing. She continues to be amazing. She would, in fact, work the night shift at a rope factory so that she could spend the day with me and my 2 younger brothers, because we were all musicians, driving us to our lessons, making sure we practiced. And it is another one of those things where, in retrospect, I am so thankful to her for pushing me and not letting me give up. And because it's because of her, and the fact that nothing was ever good enough, right? Like no matter what I might have done or may have accomplished, it was never good enough. And what that did is really demonstrate to me that with hard work, anything that seems impossible, I can do. And if I make a huge mistake, right, and I want to beat myself up for it, that's okay, because I've also learned, right, performing, that you have to go on, right, and you learn from the mistakes you make. And so as much as I disliked it growing up, as much as I wanted to be outside playing with my friends, going to parties, doing the normal things that people do, I so appreciate the fact that she pushed me that way, because the lessons I learned from that continue to influence me and impact me today. Because I certainly feel like no matter what the challenge, no one will outwork me ever, right? and if I fail the first time, it's painful, but it is okay, because that is how we learn. And so I really thank her.
Well, it's funny because I always kind of, while you were making beautiful music, I was like your predecessor, I was a policy debater. So I grew up worshiping Erwin Chemerinsky and David Zarefsky and all these great people in the policy debate world, and have met him. He would, I'm certain, never remember me, but it was,
I would.
Probably would. Cause he's so smart. It's that concept of you don't realize how hard you're working until you wake up one day and realize you're not doing it as much anymore and you've got all this free time. And I realized that with debate. And it's when I was reading one of the articles written about you, I smiled thinking about all the hours you must have spent on that, and the discipline it gives you. And so many people who think about producing a product in law, they want to make it perfect, and it keeps them from actually producing it. But you've got to get it out there. You've got to act. You've got to put yourself out there. And I think it's a beautiful message that I know a lot of young lawyers watch these or listen to these podcasts. So I hope they hear your message there. I know at one point you had a change. You kind of thought, well, maybe I'm going to be a professional musician, and you shifted to thinking about law. And in particular, after Yale, you became a criminal defense lawyer. I mean, I know you worked in private practice as well, but can you talk about that transformation?
Absolutely. But I love learning about your debate history, because I am so impressed by people who are debaters. It is tough, right? The amount of practice you had to put in for that, it's remarkable to me that people could do that. So sure, I'm happy to talk about that journey. So when I went to college, I thought like so many people think, I was going to be a doctor. And then I sat in organic chemistry for 2 weeks and realized, no, not going to be a doctor. That's not for me. And then, as I mentioned, as I learned more and more about the impact of race and racism in our world through my own experiences and learning from others during college, I ended up, and this is going to age me now, I ended up seeing on an index card, if people remember, right, like an index card on a bulletin board where they used to show what job opportunities were available. And I distinctly remember seeing this thing, looking for people to work at the Massachusetts Commission Against Discrimination. And it sounded fascinating to me. And so I went and I worked there, and I saw what the lawyers did, right? So being at that amazing MCAD is what they called it, Massachusetts Commission Against Discrimination, they would do things like send testers out to rent an apartment. And they'd have a black tester and a white tester with the exact, identical application. And the black tester would go out and have a perfectly nice conversation with the individual renting the apartment, but would be told, right, the apartment's already rented. And then the white tester would go to the identical individual and be able to rent the apartment. And that was such a lesson to me, right? Because the way that race can impact us in ways we're not even aware of, right? We don't even know the opportunities that haven't been provided to us because the interaction itself is so pleasant. You would never imagine, right, that would happen. So that experience is why I decided this is what I want to do. I want to be a civil rights lawyer. This is so wrong. I want to spend my life doing this. But the only problem then that I had is I could not speak in public. I would much rather perform the piano, as nervous as that made me. I know many people share this. I could not speak in public. I couldn't even speak in a seminar with 12 people in it in college, right? Like I just couldn't do it. But I was able to figure out how to do that during law school. And then right when I had one foot out the door, so it was my second semester of my third year in law school, I had a Skadden Public Interest Fellowship to do immigration work in LA and in New York. I thought I was going to be an immigration lawyer. And then I took a class on race and the death penalty. Stephen Bright was visiting at the law school. That was his first semester there. He changed my life, literally changed my life. I finished the 2 years of my Skadden, and I immediately started doing death penalty, habeas appeals, and then became a federal and state public defender, and then criminal defense and private practice. So that is sort of the journey that I had.
It's amazing. I mean, there's so many things about what you just said that are amazing. To think that you ever were reticent to speak with how articulate and engaging you are is shocking. But I know we all come from somewhere, right? We all have different paths.
Right.
And I mean, there are so many experiences that no one needs to hear about my stories. But if you were to ask me my most transformative experience as a lawyer, it was a death penalty habeas case where I was the client relationship person with somebody on starting in my second year as a lawyer. And so one day offline, we will compare notes on that. But that was probably my, represented him for 11 years and got to know him very well. And still kind of get the chills thinking about that experience. So I know the passion and I know the process observations anyone who has defended somebody on death row will make. Somebody says to, I'm sure you hear this all the time. I'm white, a man, I am a very tolerant person. I don't see race. I'm not. Can you explain for those who don't understand what implicit bias really means? Can you just set everybody's definition?
Sure. Absolutely. And I'd love to hear your story sometime, especially your experiences representing someone on death row. But we'll put that aside for now. So implicit bias is basically our brain's effort to understand the world. And our brain, so as lawyers, right, we feel like we have complete control over everything that's going on in our minds, but we really don't. So what our brains do is it puts things into categories, everything, right? So for anyone on this call today or in this meeting today, if you happen to be sitting in a chair, I'm certain that you spent not a second thinking about what you do with that object. Or if you're holding a pen or you're typing on your phone, right, your brain has already learned what things like a chair look like, what you do with a phone and a pen and a cup. And your brain does that because it categorizes things based on constant exposure. And pretty soon, when you see something that looks like a chair, your brain automatically, because you can't stop it from doing it, automatically, quickly, and unconsciously lets you understand, without you consciously thinking about it, what to do with that chair. And so our brains, because they are so efficient, they do this with everything, including people. So it is our brain's way of understanding the world, of conserving your resources, your cognitive resources, so you can pay attention to the motion you're writing, the argument you're about to make. And meanwhile, all sorts of things are going on in the background that affect your conscious thoughts, your perceptions, your feelings, your behaviors, and unconscious bias. When we talk about that, racial or gender bias, our brains within milliseconds categorize people. So all of us on this call, when you saw me, even before an introduction, when you saw me, your brain has decided within milliseconds what race I am and what gender I am. And as a result of that, your brain then applies what it has learned are the stereotypes, your beliefs about whatever category I was placed in, and your attitudes, whether they're positive or negative that you've learned. It applies those attributes to me. And after that, the way you treat me, the way you interpret my ambiguous behaviors, the way you hear what I am saying is all impacted by the associations your unconscious brain has made. And you might not even consciously agree with the unconscious associations that your brain has made. But your brain, like some of these AI or artificial intelligence systems, it just takes in all the data and creates its version of an algorithm, right? And so it really doesn't matter whether you agree or disagree. Your brain takes in the inputs and then learns the stereotypes, learns the attitudes, and make these judgments within milliseconds. And you might not even be consciously aware that it's happening or that it's impacting the way that you view me, interpret me, behave towards me, all of it.
I may be one of the few people who has read Infinite Jest from beginning to end, including the footnotes. David Foster. It reminds me of right the way he starts that famous graduation speech where he talks about the two fish swimming in the water and they pass an older fish and the older fish says, "Hey boys, how's the water?" And the two younger fish swim past and look at each other quizzically and say, "What's water?"
Exactly.
And he goes on for 22 minutes talking about how you consciously get to choose things that you take for granted, and it's so fascinating. So, Dean Richardson, what are things, they say we're born colorblind, whatever, without some of these bias. What are some things that you see in our society that bake in bias unconsciously into who we are?
That is such a great question. And my answer is going to be very broad at first. My answer is going to be everything, right? So you can't separate the unconscious biases that we have from the centuries, starting from slavery, right, of anti-Blackness, racism, subordination. You can't separate that because the reality of how race has impacted our country from the beginning has effects, right, socially, systemically, institutionally, in terms of where people are placed within the hierarchies in our country. And that's why I say everything, because even children as young as 5 have the same unconscious biases that we as adults have. So, for instance, even children associate Black individuals with negative things, white individuals with positive things. And this is true even if the child is Black themselves, right? It's like the doll study in Brown versus Board of Education. They have redone it more recently, and the same results happen. So we learn these things just by watching the news, by the reports that we hear. There's one fascinating study that was done with one artificial intelligence system where they were training the system through machine learning, so giving it all sorts of data so that the system would learn how to understand the English language. And the way they trained the system is to take all of Google News for a particular period of time, and they just fed that in, all that data into the machine. And then the system not only learned to understand the English language, but the system also developed the same associations that we have that make up our unconscious biases. So the system learned that to be Black is to be a criminal, to be white is to be innocent, to be a male means you're more likely to be a leader, to be a woman, you're more likely to work from home, just from reading Google News. So if that happens with an AI system, that is what's happening in our brains. Regardless of whether I agree or I understand why certain things exist the way they do, my brain is just taking in the data, right? It's just seeing what it sees. So I was a criminal defense lawyer walking into a courtroom in Seattle, Washington. Most of the defendants were Black. Most of the judges and others in the courtroom were not. And though I know why that situation existed, my brain is making the association. Black equals criminal, right? Which is why I have these unconscious biases, and I do, right? It's part of why I started studying this, because I wanted to understand how could someone who is mixed, right, who considers herself Black and Korean, who's female, how could I, consciously egalitarian, a civil rights lawyer, how could I have these unconscious biases that impact my behaviors? And I do. And it's why I started learning about how our brains work, how implicit bias works, and what I can try to do to safeguard myself from acting on my unconscious biases.
Can you talk a little bit? I don't want to get too deep on this, but I think it's important to identify some of the premises of this, because we're going to get to some later as it relates to the police force. And, we find ourselves, by the way, in the aftermath of the George Floyd murder and during a worldwide pandemic with COVID-19. So just to timestamp it, can you talk a little bit about how the Daniel Kahneman research, Thinking Fast and Slow, goes into your research?
Absolutely. I love that book. Every time I speak to lawyers, I say, you must read this book, right? Because it will help you practice law better and understand the world better. And And the reason I also bring up Daniel Kahneman's book so often is when he talks about system 1 and system 2 thinking. So system 1 thinking is our quick, unconscious, automatic ways of thinking that impact system 2 thinking, which is the thing we normally think of when we think about our cognitive processes, right? It's conscious, effortful, you're aware of what's going on in your head. And what he demonstrates through decades of his remarkable research is that the unconscious system 1 can often impact our conscious thoughts in ways that we're completely unaware of, right? And really unable to control. And so in his book, he talks about all of these, what he calls cognitive biases, right? All the heuristics or rules of thumb that we use to make decisions. And that book could have been written about unconscious racial and gender biases, because what I'm talking about is just a small subset of the way that our brain typically works. And system 1 thinking, that unconscious, quick, automatic thinking that impacts our conscious thoughts, that is also where unconscious bias sits, right? So in the same way that we are influenced by a random number that's given to us and it affects our numeric judgments later, you could switch out a random number and put in race, right? So race or gender as an input unconsciously affects our conscious thoughts, behaviors, feelings, judgments. So his book is further demonstration of why no one should be shocked that every bias that we have when it comes to numbers or anything else, hot and cold, insects and flowers, right? No matter what you might think of as a bias, race is and gender are obvious things that also influence us in our society. So I love that book. And
yeah, I do too. And I knew it had to be an underpinning of your thinking, but then I saw it in one of the articles. Is it fair to say that we almost have to admit to something that everyone has resisted admitting, which is we're all racist, we're all sexist, we all have something that is unconscious in us, influenced by characteristics we observe about people or learn about people? Is that a fair starting point?
I think it is. I think it is. And I think when people hear the word racist, then they add to it that negative intent, right? That bigotry that we think about. And I understand, I resist that, right? I don't consider myself a conscious, bigoted, explicit racist, but I definitely am impacted by race and by gender, and I might do exactly the same thing that a consciously bigoted person would do on purpose. They might do it on purpose. I might do it without even realizing that I'm doing it. And that's what makes it so pernicious, right? Because we don't even know that we're acting on our unconscious biases, both positively and negatively, right? So I just want to make sure I make that point. When we talk about bias, it's not simply treating certain groups badly. It's also about treating other groups better, right? So, and we end up with disparities and bias through both of those pathways, not just one. And I think that's an important point to remember too.
Yeah, and it's, you talk about this in your research, that the impact of when it comes into your consciousness, the impact of that bias creates anxiety, not just in the person. You might think, well, that person is Black, and so they are very anxious because they're walking in a neighborhood and they may be perceived to be a criminal, in a particular story. But it's also the white person interacting with that person, or the other person of another race interacting with. They have anxiety, which can make decision making. Can you talk a little bit about how the decision making gets harmed through these unconscious bias?
Absolutely. And I love the point that you just made about anxiety, because there are studies, and it connects up to implicit bias, but they call it racial anxiety. And it happens in exactly the way you mentioned, where both before you engage in an interracial interaction and then during an interracial interaction, we often, especially with strangers, we often feel anxious. Because if you're a white individual about to engage with me and you don't really know me, you might be anxious that you might do something or say something that'll make me think that you're a racist, right? And from my perspective, speaking to you, I might worry that you will do or say something or treat me differently because of my identity characteristics. And what the studies demonstrate with regard to this anxiety is it makes us look more unfriendly. Our body language is more unfriendly. We make less eye contact. We make more speech errors. We end the interaction earlier. All of these are signs of anxiety. But when two people are anxious, and there's a self-fulfilling prophecy effect. So if you are engaged in like nonverbal behaviors that seem unfriendly, like not making eye contact and folding having your arms folded, I'm going to mirror your behaviors. And then you're going to react to me. And so the whole interaction goes downhill. And the worst thing about all of it is when we are anxious, this gets to the colorblind point you made earlier. You might be saying to yourself, I know that song is Korean. Let me not ask her whether she likes kimchi because it's, a Korean vegetable that we all eat. Don't ask her that. And so your brain, in an attempt to follow your direction, is going to think about kimchi, bring kimchi to the forefront of your mind so that you can suppress it. And guess what happens? You find yourself asking me, right? The very thing you didn't want to do is exactly the thing you are more likely to do, confirming for me that you potentially have a problem, right, with race, in addition to the fact that you look really uncomfortable and that you leave the interaction early. And so what I find so fascinating about this series of studies is the lesson, at least I take from it, is you cannot make accurate judgments about people just from what might happen at your initial interaction, right? Because in some of the studies, the actual bigot appears very comfortable because they could care less, right, what the person of color thinks about them. So that's one thing that can happen in these interactions. And then some of the effects are, I'll just give you a couple. They have found in schools that this racial anxiety that I just mentioned makes it more likely that white teachers will not give critical but necessary feedback to their students of color because they are worried they'll be accused of racism. Or at the workplace, people feel less willing to mentor people who are different from them because of the worry that they're going to do or say something that'll result in accusations of bias. And the final thing is, because this can play out during interviews. So there was a set of interview studies, and they found that when people are experiencing this type of anxiety and you have these effects, these non-verbal effects, and the interview won't feel as comfortable, it won't feel as organic, you'll start thinking that person's not a good fit. It also impacts judgments of competence. So we think others are less competent when they are exhibiting some of these non-verbal behaviors and making the speech errors and all the other things I just told you about. So the impacts, these non-verbal impacts that I just mentioned and verbal impacts have real effects, right, in our day-to-day work lives, in our day-to-day lives, in interviews, et cetera. So it's really quite pernicious.
So what do you tell, we're obviously in the legal industry, but this would apply to any leader of a big organization. What can leaders of an organization do to stem the tide of the impact? I mean, we're not going to ever get rid of it. It doesn't sound like a form of bias unconsciously. So how can we stem that impact of that bias on our decision making?
So, and I love the way that you frame that, because I often talk about this as what can we do to safeguard ourselves, right, from acting on these biases versus how can we get rid of them in our heads, which is so difficult to do for all the reasons we've already talked about. So when I have to think about these things too, because as I mentioned, I'm impacted by them, right? So the goal is to put in systems and structures that can safeguard ourselves from acting on these biases, systems that can help us address the anxiety that I talked about. So I'll just mention a few at different levels of granularity. So I'll start with, since we just talked about interviews, I'll talk about the interviews, right? It is critically important that if you're going to do interviews of people, you figure out with your committee, which should be diverse for all sorts of reasons, you figure out beforehand what are the qualities of the person that you're looking for? What is the criteria upon which we're going to judge everyone? Because otherwise, studies demonstrate that we change the criteria to hire the person that we want, either consciously or unconsciously. I mean, there's a sheriff study where there's a female sheriff and a male sheriff, or chief, police chief. And if the female police chief had more street smarts, then the committee really cared about book smarts. And if the female had book smarts, then the committee cared more about street smarts, right? So they had a female and a male police chief. And we do this unconsciously. I'm not saying we do this on purpose. It's just right? And so having those criteria, fighting over those criteria before anyone walks in the door, determining whether any of the metrics you're using embed bias themselves, thinking outside of the box about the type of person and criteria you want to use before anyone comes in. And then when someone comes in and you find yourself resisting the criteria that you have created prior to anyone coming in, that's a sign that maybe unconscious bias is impacting your judgment of that individual. So that's one thing. Another is, and people hate this one, coming up with the set of questions that you're going to ask every single candidate in the identical order, and it feels very stiff.
That'd be
when
hard
you do that.
Yeah.
Exactly. Me too, because you want to have a conversation. But when you have that conversation, that what I talked to you about in terms of racial anxiety and how it can impact those conversations, implicit bias does the same thing in those conversations. So you might end up feeling great about particular people because they're like you have lots in common, right? Versus the person that you don't have much in common with. It's stiffer. It doesn't feel like that person's a good fit. It affects your views of their competence. And that's really hard to do, right? To come up with that set of questions in the same order and sticking to it. It is one way, though, to attempt to safeguard against the influences of these unconscious biases on our judgments. I guess I'll mention one more, but there's so many. There are these studies about the way that our unconscious biases leak into recommendation letters, right? Gendered and race. We tend to write them differently, use more stereotypical terms in them. But the intervention of reminding yourself before you write a recommendation letter or conduct a performance eval that your unconscious biases may impact how you write this thing, how you think about the individual, you can overcome and make the differences disappear. So reminders to managers before they do performance evals helps. Having diversity within the workplace is something that helps, because now you can create the diverse teams, and that can, even if you all have unconscious biases by virtue of our conscious minds with our different experiences, sharing those different experiences about a person who came in for an interview, for instance, about a strategy that you might want to take, about a judgment you might have made about a coworker, those things can help. Because ultimately, to try to overcome, if you think about nothing else, to try to overcome the impact of these biases is to not multitask when you're making an important decision, because otherwise your brain will fill in the missing pieces. Get as much information as possible so you're not exercising great discretion, because once again, your brain will fill in then the missing pieces. Take your time. So don't make impactful decisions when you're in a rush. If you just remember, and don't be colorblind, right? Actually pay attention to race and to gender. So many people, studies again demonstrate, pretend to be colorblind because they think that to notice color is to be racist, right? It comes from anxiety. And so I'm here to tell you, as a person of color, noticing color, paying attention to what the color, right, and don't be colorblind is actually a necessary precondition to trying to address the impact of unconscious racial bias.
So many great tips there. I know people are going to love listening to this because it's really, some of it's counterintuitive, right? I mean, we create systems so tolerant, but in that attempt to be tolerant and inclusive, we frequently miss some basic systemic steps that we need to be taking to change the decision-making outcome, which is really what we're trying to do. Thank you. That was a great response. So you are, you were just now talking to law firm leaders, corporate leaders. We're not under the same stress that the police officer who murdered George Floyd was under, or the countless others by video cams. I know that you've been asked to counsel numerous communities, police departments. You're somebody that in the last many years has been the person to go to on this topic. What do you tell that police officer who, may perceive a threat to his or her life? What is that? How is your advice nuanced for the police officer training?
Oh, that is such a great question. So I think I'll start out by just acknowledging that there are racist officers that exist, and I'm not interested in talking about that right now because they're just in the same way that I'm not interested in figuring out what do we do with racist people who are consciously racist, right? I don't care to address that because the real problem for me are people like us, right? The fact that and I'll share the story because we talked about racial anxiety and it's really counterintuitive. There were these studies of police officers and they first tested the individual officer to see how worried that officer was that because it's mostly men, that he would be judged to be a racist, right? So the higher your racial anxiety, the more worried that officer was that he would be viewed as racist. And then they put him in a simulator that they use often to practice when they should shoot someone, when they should use force. And what they found is the higher the officer's level of racial anxiety, the more the officer was worried that he would be viewed to be racist, the more likely he was to use force against a Black man, not only in the simulator, but also when you looked at his actual record of uses of force against people of different races, more likely to have used force against Black individuals in real life.
Fascinating.
So, talk about counterintuitive, right? Right? Like, how could that possibly be? The fear of being racist actually makes you do things that are racist, right? To shoot and use force against Black individuals more often than individuals of other races. I share that with police departments when I speak to them. And part of the reason I share it is to go back to the question you asked earlier. What can we do with the reality of implicit bias and racial anxiety? And my answers are most often going to be institutional, systemic, and structural. Because that officer who worries about being viewed as racist, part of the reason for that are the policing practices that exist, right? In my view, the problematic policing practices that lead to racist behaviors, even if officers are not racist, right? So telling officers that you have a quota in the number of tickets or the number of people you arrest or the number of people you stop on the street. When you tell if I were a police officer with my own commitments, I am also someone who wants to succeed in my job. And so if I know that I just need to write a bunch of tickets, stop a bunch of people, right, arrest a bunch of people, where am I going to do it? I'm not going to go to the ritzy places of town to make those arrests in restaurants, right? I'm going to go to the place where politically it is easier for me to do that. So when we think about policing, and I'm talking about the perception and the reality that some policing practices are very problematic, it's not just about that officer. It is about looking at what are the policing practices we have in place? What has the Supreme Court done in its Fourth Amendment doctrine that facilitates some of these problematic policing practices? How do we incentivize officers and the jobs that they do? What is the culture of police departments? Can we diversify police departments to get more females in these departments, more people of different gender identities? Because that makes a difference. It's those types of things I think we should be focused on, not simply this one individual officer. Is he a racist or is he not, right? That deflects us from the real important, impactful conversations that I think we need to be having on these issues.
No, it's so right. I mean, and it's why the materials that we're absorbing now, shame on those of us who've absorbed more because of somebody getting murdered on a videotape, but the deconstruction of those things that have been embedded in our brains. Yes. Who really thought of Birth of a Nation? I mean, I know you would have, and people who are steeped in these issues, but the fact that our president of the United States watched that movie when it came out in the early 1900s, and how did that impact the way we think of things? This three strikes and all the criminal justice reform that we've had, getting that deconstructed is so important. It's actually why I like doing these, because when you learn about somebody at a very granular level, some of the other basic stuff that you're generalizing about kind of fades away. And the lessons, whether they're lessons about implicit bias or leadership or how to be a better lawyer or how to think about things the way a client thinks, they become just more impactful. So I so appreciate you diving deeper into that topic, because I think it's important. So I think you've answered this, but I suspect you've got a little bit more. Why is it so important? We published a resource guide for K&L Gates on things to read. Why is it so important now, more than ever, for people who aren't in the category of being bigoted, but who are in the category of just trying to listen better, listen more and read more and watch more? Why is that important right now? Especially right now, I think it's important because, remarkably to me, because I am a cynic, I guess I'm also an optimist, but this is a moment where it seems, at least, that something might change for real, right? Because every time something like this happens, people fall all over themselves to say what they're going to say, and then we forget about it and move on to something else. This moment seems and feels different. And I don't know if it's because we're all stuck at home in a global pandemic. I don't know why, right? But it feels different. And so at this moment in time, having allies, the thing that makes me hopeful that this time might be different is when I see the protests taking place across the country, and it is a diverse group of people. And more people reach out wanting to learn more about the things that they don't know. And the more of us that understand the history of our country, the experiences of people who just experience our world differently, to build the empathy and understanding of what it's like to navigate the world in our different bodies, builds empathy, builds understanding, builds then the ability to have the next step, conversations about the next step. And so what I mean by that is, when we think about, there's so often questions about hot topics like, do we have quotas and affirmative action? Why is it that certain immigrant groups can make it, but Black people just can't? And I hear things like this all the time. And the problem with the answers is it is not a quick soundbite, right? To answer these, I understand the question. To answer them takes more than 10 seconds. And if we can all start from a level of knowledge where we don't have to start from the beginning to explain how it is that we ended up here, when we don't have to start from the beginning to talk about, Jim Crow was just around the corner. It wasn't like it happened centuries and centuries ago. We are still dealing with the impacts of our entire
history. But if we don't understand what that history is and we only start from today, it is impossible to talk about the structural, systemic, institutional changes that need to be made. So that's why it's important. People are paying attention to it now. Now is a time to really learn more about the experiences of people in this country so that we can have that second stage of conversations at a level that's impactful versus always having to start from a history lesson that people get bored with within 15 seconds.
Well, I don't, but yes.
I know you don't.
That's why you're a hero right now. I mean, you really are. You're bringing. You've been a voice on these important topics in a way. I mean, I love the vulnerability of the way you talk about this topic. You know, with a acknowledgement. You're not perfect. You come at things with bias as well. And I think that disarms people to say, "Oh, you're not judging me as a bad person." Is there something that are, you know, you're watching this right now, and you're a person of faith. You go to a synagogue, a mosque, a church every weekend. Is there a way to have these conversations in those settings that can advance the ball? Have you thought about that topic? I'm sure you have.
I have. Right. And I think what's so important about what you say is that often people think that because they're not a person of color, because they might not have experienced these things, that they are illegitimate in some way to talk about these things, to share, right, their perspective. I disagree with that view, right? I fundamentally, myself personally, I disagree with that view. And so people have the ability to reach people, like you have the ability to speak to people and have them hear you that would never hear me. Right? Not to say that they have an issue with my race and my gender, et cetera, but the anxiety that might come, the fear about asking questions that they might feel would offend me, right? Or they're embarrassed about. People like people who are like them. Like that's what these studies demonstrate all the time. So if you know about these issues and you can have a conversation with your church, your synagogue, your family, your friends, when they say something that you think they shouldn't say, you can have a conversation with them explaining why maybe they shouldn't say that, or sharing with them more information about policing or any of the death penalty. I think it's so important for us as members of our own communities to use our own legitimacy to have those conversations, because I can't reach everyone. Right. And we need all of us as a country, because you care about these issues. I care about these issues. So then we can make a commitment to reach out to those people that we influence to grow the amount of people who understand and really want to make change. So that's what, to go back to your question too, that's why it's important to read some of these things too, because you are armored to have those conversations with people who would actually listen to you and not be unable to listen to me.
And that's true love for people is really understanding, taking them where they are and
exactly,
and helping them. So I could talk to you for about a day and a half straight breaks, and I can't do that because that would be taking advantage of you. So a few quick exit questions. You've seen all the suggestions of what people should be reading. Give us a couple of your favorite books, movies, videos. What are some resources that you particularly like that you would recommend to people listening to this?
Oh, that's hard. So I'll just talk about one book because I think it's useful to the question that we just talked about. You want to talk about race. That is literally the name of the book. And each chapter is about the questions that you might have had. Like, isn't it just about class? What does intersectionality mean? What should we think about with the police? It is a fabulous book because so many of our burning questions are answered there. So that and Ta-Nehisi Coates' book, Between the World and Me, love that book too, right? Love that book.
Yeah. The letter to his 15-year-old son, right?
Yeah, exactly. I love I love both of those books so much. And then in terms of movies and series, and there's just too many for me to name, right? 13 is a great one. The one about the Central Park the Central Park rape. That's a painful. I haven't actually been able to watch that one because I remember it when it happened, and everything I hear about it is it's fabulous. When They See Me, I think that's what it's called. When They See Me, about the 5 African American boys who falsely confessed to raping a white woman in Central Park. So that's a great one. Yeah, there's so much. Really, it's hard for me to pick just a few.
We're fellow Texans, and I went to this all-boy private school, and a couple of Acho brothers came out of that school who went on to play in the NFL. And Emmanuel Acho is on ESPN, and my heart burst because with pride, because he's producing a podcast called Uncomfortable Conversations with a Black Man. And it's really just him explaining brick by brick in these little 10, 15-minute segments, what it is like to be Black in America. And it's a podcast series that I particularly like. Acho is ACHO, but there are too many good ones, including really some work that went to challenging the death penalty back in the day. The legal research for those lawyers out there who want to understand how unconscious bias infects our jury system. And I know you've researched and written gobs about that. We could go on forever. But I've got to tell you how honored I am to have a conversation with you at this time. I can't imagine how exhausted you are right now, because this is a time that your voice is more important than ever for our world. And so I just can't thank you enough on behalf of all the people who don't get to thank you, but who benefit from your thought leadership on these topics, for all you do really to advance this conversation.
I appreciate that so much. Thank you for taking the time and for inviting me to participate in this conversation with you. I'm so happy to finally meet you, even if it's over video, and I really appreciated and enjoyed our conversation very much. So thank you so much.
Well, we have Kelly Barba to thank. And anyway, thank you again. Thanks for your time. Have a great week, and I will be in touch.
That sounds wonderful. Take care. Be safe and healthy. Take care.
You too.